The horrific murder of Aboubakar Cisse shocked the Muslim community of France.
The murderer stabbed him 57 times whilst the brother was actually in sujood. Most of the time, the Islamophobic motive is completely denied. So the symbolic violence of such a denial is quite stark, is quite shocking. It's unacceptable to recognize that this is not just a single violent act, but it's actually something that is the direct result of an Islamophobic atmosphere that is nurtured, fueled by the discourses of people like the Minister of the Interior.
As elections come closer, Rayan Freschi from Cage International talks to us about how the French state has conspired once again to demonize Muslims. How do they get away with making these sort of conflations between religious practice and links to political groups?
The emergence of that generation, if it survives the state attempts at essentially erasing our collective memory of struggle, we might be maybe more successful in the future.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, dear brother Jalal. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's lovely to have you with us. Now, you've come to visit us from France, and often we know as British Muslims that there are challenges for Muslims all over the Western world and beyond. But often we say to ourselves that in conversation that at least we're not like France when it comes to the treatment of Muslims. And I suspect that from our last conversation, we know that the French state has a very heavy hand when it comes to the Muslim community. But I understand that there have been some really worrying developments over the last year or so, and I want to capture those developments, inshallah. But let's start with a horrific case that I think most of us saw on social media, and that was the murder of this young man, Aboubakar Cisse, who was murdered in a masjid, I think, in France. Just talk us through what happened there and who the perpetrator was. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your question. And yes, regarding the case of brother Aboubakar Cisse, rahimahullah, what happened is a young man came to the masjid pretending to be essentially interested in Islam. And Abu Bakr welcomed him and essentially taught him how to pray. I don't know if you guys saw the video, which is quite shocking, but it was essentially showing him how to pray Salah, right? And whilst he was showing him how to pray, the murderer stabbed him 57 times whilst the brother was actually in sujood. So, Shahid, inshallah, that's what we hope for him.
Ameen.
And right after the murder, the man actually recorded a series of videos on social media where he essentially declared his racist and Islamophobic intent and motive, right? So he fled the country. He went to Italy in a city, Pistoia, near Florence. He was arrested there, and now he's been brought back to France. And at some point, he should be, of course, prosecuted, charged, and convicted for his murder.
Yeah, my understanding is that at the time or just after the killing, officials, local officials, national officials, politicians were very reticent to pick up on that white supremacy or that sort of racist element or the Islamophobic element of the crime, and instead focus very much on the personal mental breakdown maybe of this particular individual.
Exactly.
Just talk me through sort of the political reaction to his murder.
I think it's quite a feature of French Islamophobia. Actually, not just French Islamophobia. It's a feature of Islamophobia worldwide. Each and every time that a murder or physical aggression takes place and one of us is actually attacked by someone, most of the time the Islamophobic motive is, to say the least, toned down or I should say actually completely denied. And psychological excuses are used essentially not to justify the murder, but to explain it, right? And it's a way of essentially depoliticizing the entire case, and in a very subtle and quite vicious way, it's a way to almost deny the existence or at least the gravity of the Islamophobic phenomenon at play, right? So the symbolic violence of such a denial is quite stark, is quite shocking. And as you outlined, what really I'm not sure that it surprised us, but it deeply wounded the Muslim community in France, is that the Minister of the Interior, Bruno Retailleau, actually refused to visit the masjid and the local Muslim community, right? He actually went to the prefect, which is essentially the local executive authority, but he didn't pay any visit to the community that was grieving one of its key members.
Why? Why would he not have done that?
I think just the degree of French Islamophobia is such that it's unacceptable to recognize that this is not just a single act of a single violent act, but it's actually something that is the direct result of a Islamophobic context, of an Islamophobic atmosphere that is, in a way or another, directly nurtured, fueled by the discourses of people like Bruno Retailleau, the Minister of the Interior, and the entire political spectrum. It's something that is quite a specific feature of the French context and is actually being analyzed by scholars of Islamophobia worldwide. That feature is the denial of racism and the denial of Islamophobia by French society, by the French state. It's something that is quite shocking. The degree of denial, as I've mentioned, is truly staggering, and it leads to these kind of responses, institutional responses. Just recall what happened in Christchurch in 2019. After what happened, the response, the institutional response, the political response was completely different. Of course, structural Islamophobia wasn't abolished or didn't vanish, of course, but at least there were some decent symbolic gestures that essentially demonstrated that there was a willingness to show some solidarity, some common decency after a brutal attack on Muslims. At the time, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, she wore hijab in solidarity of the Muslim community, which was quite a strong gesture. Whatever we think of the political move, at least it's an overt sign of solidarity. And that's clearly not what happened in France. Actually, something far worse happened a few weeks afterwards.
Local leaders and organizations started a water trucking program.
As part of fighting hunger and malnutrition program of Baitulmaal staff has donated about 24 trips of water trucks such as this one that you can see behind us.
People were dying here. There was no water, kids were not going to school. It has become a major issue. And this is not the first time we've responded. We've responded even in the past seasons. But we need to find a sustainable solution.
We are here on behalf of Baitulmaal to meet and understand the need of these beautiful people here. This water tank, the truck comes here and it supplies this well for water that is sustainable for a whole week.
We are also distributing food rations to affected families by drought in this region. We are distributing this food to vulnerable communities who need these food parcels.
We're waiting for your donations.
We'll come to it. So the French minister, overseas minister, Emmanuel Valls, he said about the accusation that this crime was in some way motivated by Islamophobia. He said Islamophobia is a term that was invented over 30 years ago by the Iranian mullahs. I mean, what's going on there? Why did he?
It's actually a conspiratorial theory that has been adopted by some politicians and some Islamophobic intellectuals, according to which Islamophobia, the term, is, as you've mentioned, invented by the Iranian mullahs in the 70s in order to prevent any critic of Islam as a deen, as a religion. It's just yet another tactic used in order to deny not just the term, but actually the existence of any Islamophobic hatred, of the Islamophobic phenomenon in the French context. It's a tactic that the French political spectrum has used since the dawn of the War on Terror, so essentially the 2000s. But it wasn't adopted by the state, essentially. That wasn't the case right after 2001 and so on and so forth. But now, very clearly, this conspiracy theory and other conspiracy theories, and we're going to discuss that right afterwards, are now actually not only adopted but also promoted by the state in order to essentially deny, as I've mentioned, the reality of any violence towards Muslims.
How much of the response by the political elites, I mean, these politicians belong to what essentially is a centrist government or centre-right government of Emmanuel Macron. How much of it is a nod to the far right that are now surging in the polls? In fact, in your last parliamentary election, Marine Le Pen did very well and came very close to a majority, or at least to a sizable grouping in Parliament. So there is a tendency growing in France. And how much is it that these politicians are having to echo some of the values and some of the problems or challenges that these parties have?
I think the explanation is twofold.
Yeah.
The first part of the explanation is the one that you just outlined. Clearly, the surge of the far right is quite historic. If you look at the numbers, during last year's snap elections, Le Pen's party secured the most votes, actually. These votes were not translated into a majority in parliament as a result of some tactical moves made by other parties. But still, her party came first in terms of votes, which is completely unprecedented in the recent history of French politics. So that's quite massive. And very clearly, that surge promotes very racist and Islamophobic discourses and policies and so on and so forth, because they are essentially becoming mainstream, right? So there's that aspect of other parties that are trying to seduce some of the voters of the far right using the same language and the same discourse. But I think that's not the only reason why. I think that very clearly, majority of the political spectrum actually adopts Islamophobia, not just as a, let's say, tactical move, but really because they believe that Muslims should be governed through Islamophobia.
Right.
Because I believe strongly that they believe we are an existential threat to the Republic, to the French nation.
We last spoke a couple of years ago, and this was during the whole debate about the separatism bill.
Yeah.
And at that time, the government was looking to create a piece of legislation that would make it much more difficult for Muslims to separate from wider society. Now that bill has become an act of government. Just go through the impact that bill has had on the day-to-day lives of Muslims.
Yeah, the impact is wide-ranging and is quite disruptive for the day-to-day life of the Muslim civil society. Just to give you some context, it was adopted in 2021, a few years after the state began a nationwide policy entitled the Systematic Obstruction Policy, that was essentially meant to obstruct, right, using any piece of legislation possible, the political growth, the how can I say that? The natural functioning of the Muslim civil society.
Yeah.
And before the adoption of the anti-separatism law, we had a few thousand Muslim establishments that were targeted by the administration through repeated controls, and some of those Muslim establishments were actually closed down by the government.
Okay. Give me examples of organizations that were shut down.
For example, this is CIF, which was the leader of the anti-Islamophobia struggle in France, Baraka City, the most famous humanitarian group in France, the Nawa Publishing House, a very famous Muslim publisher in France. But also some masjids were closed down, some restaurants as well, some businesses as well. So it was quite wide-ranging. And the anti-separatism law was adopted in order to essentially allow the state, grant the state even more executive powers in order to deepen the impact of that policy. And right now, the latest data shared by the government demonstrates that at least 30,000 establishments were targeted by these controls, by the administration, and at least 1,000 of these establishments were actually closed down. On top of that, and that's also something that is a clear way to obstruct the growth of our community, at least 55 million euros were seized by the state in the last few years.
Some of my viewers may say that, okay, maybe there is a case to argue that some Muslims are separating themselves too much from wider society. Just spell out for me what types of behaviors were captured by the state when it passed this bill.
What's really important to realize is that what is actually being criminalized is not, let's say, a specific political strategy used by some Muslims in the community. It's really the adherence to Islam. So you're praying, so you are clearly Muslim because you have a beard, because you're wearing hijab, because you are, as I mentioned, visibly Muslim, because you're a practicing Muslim, whatever the degree of your practice actually is, whatever school of Aqidah or whatever school of fiqh you're actually following, that's not the point. It really is your Muslimness that is directly being targeted and criminalized by the state. So it's the separatism. We could go deeper on why the French state adopted that specific term, separatism. Even from a philosophical standpoint, I think it's a way of, I would argue, criminalizing a key feature of our Muslimness, which is what I describe as the ummatic allegiance. The idea that as Muslims, we do not fit into the French ethno-nationalistic project. Because as Muslims, we belong first and foremost to the Ummah. And this is not something that we can compromise on. It's not something that we can reform or change. We are part of a wider community. And this is something that directly contradicts the foundation of the French Republic and the foundation of the French ethno-nationalistic project. A few years ago, former Minister of the Interior, Darmanin, he made a speech on Islam and Muslims, and he said, Muslims in France exclusively belong to the national community. Essentially, you guys do not belong to the wider Ummah. You just belong, you exclusively belong to the French state, which is a way of completely denying a pillar of Islam and our Muslimness. It's not something that we can
Didn't he
actually
say,
discuss.
if I remember right, he said something like, if there's a competition between Allah and the French state, the French state comes before Allah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's something that. The one of the key phrases is the laws of the Republic are above the laws of Allah.
All right.
It essentially encapsulates the overarching spirit of French Islamophobia.
So I want to then go to the events of these last couple of months, because there's a report which many of my viewers will probably not know very much about. There's a report that's been published by the French state about the Muslim community yet again. Just take us through what this report insinuates and of course the impact of this report.
Of course. So the report is supposed to focus on the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood in French society through a strategy of entrism. Right? That's exactly the title of the report, actually. It's the focus of the report. And it was commissioned a year ago, in May 2024, during a Council of Defense in which Macron and some key ministers actually were a part of. Imagine that a Council of Defense is actually a big deal. It's something that is being organized in order to address very serious issues like, I don't know, the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, whatever. And on top of that, of course, the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is now regarded as a key threat to the nation. Right. And I think at least one ambassador, an ex-ambassador to the Muslim world, was asked to essentially gather evidence of a covert plot led by the Muslim Brotherhood that was supposed to subvert the republic in order to establish Sharia law. Right. So it's very clearly a conspiracy theory. It's an absurd conspiratorial discourse, and it almost makes me laugh, except that it's something that is taken very seriously by the highest members of the state. Literally, the president commissioned that report. Mm-hmm. And the report was supposed to be published last fall, actually. So, and that's also something that makes me laugh because it really, it sounds like a movie. The actual Minister of the Interior, Retailleau, he said, well, the report's results are so alarming that we had to classify it, and I'm going to essentially write a summary of that report. I'll be able to publicize, essentially, and publish and divulge. And that summary was published a few weeks ago. Right. Again, imagine that we started our discussion with the brutal murder of Aboubakar Cisse, rahimahullah. One could argue that as a result of such a murder, the French state could have at least halted its Islamophobic agenda, at least for a few months, because we were grieving the death of Abu Bakr. On top of that, there's a genocide in Palestine. The situation is quite difficult and harsh for us. It didn't. They published the report, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after the murder of Aboubakar Cisse, whilst we were still grieving, right? And they published that. And the report is essentially, what's the content of the report? It's essentially a short historical breakdown of the Muslim Brotherhood, so how it started in Egypt, Hassan al-Banna, and so on and so forth. And then there's let's say a list, a description of Muslim organizations, very wide-ranging Muslim organizations, some that are advocating for Muslim rights, but also organizations that are involved in humanitarian work, Islamic education, whatever. And they are essentially accused of being affiliated to the global Muslim Brotherhood. What's quite amazing is that there's literally no evidence that demonstrates that affiliation. And moreover, in the very first page of the report says, by the way, we acknowledge that we can't be entirely sure that the Muslim Brotherhood is actually present in the country. So it's quite amazing that the report itself acknowledges the complete lack of scientific foundation of that work.
So my understanding is that the report effectively says that there is this Muslim Brotherhood plot to take over organizations, civil society in the country. Mm-hmm. And the idea is entryism. So the idea is to access the highest levels of French society in order to implement Sharia law. Exactly. That's the idea behind it. And people are taking this seriously in France?
Apparently, yes. And I think it's always difficult to assess how the wider public is responding to these discourses and these policies. But given the kind of electoral behaviors that we've witnessed in the last few years, I wouldn't be surprised if actually a majority of the population is actually buying it. Because it's not just coming from, a small part of a small white supremacist group, and they're trying to share these shocking ideas, shocking conspiracy theories. Now these theories are directly adopted and promoted by the state. And to the wider public, Macron is not far right. We both know that his discourse, that the way the government is governing Muslims is clearly through Islamophobia, clearly through a far-right discourse. But the way it's perceived by the masses is not necessarily like that. So it's not completely absurd to actually believe that a majority of the French population maybe, find that theory actually quite serious, or at least that there's something in it that might require a strong response from the state. Very clearly, there's if the starting point of our analysis is that white supremacy is actually the system that is governing the West at large, I very clearly sense that our presence, Muslims' presence in the West, and more specifically in France, clearly triggers a strong and deep degree of paranoia, a sense of maybe that white privilege is becoming fragile because Muslims are not only present, but their influence is actually growing, which in a way is not something that is completely legitimate or absurd. As any community, it's quite understandable that we might be interested in politics, in having a say in the political discourse, in the political competition at large. It's not something that is completely absurd. Every community, religious, ethnic, or whatever, is trying to protect its way of life, trying to push some policies, trying to influence the body politic. It's something that is completely natural. But I think as a result of the deep Islamophobic dehumanization that is a direct result of white supremacy and a direct result of the war on terror, a direct result of the genocidal era of Islamophobia we are currently in, it's unacceptable for the white supremacist system to, it's unacceptable that Muslims might have a political voice. And if we go even deeper, if you look at the literature on dehumanization, if you look at the works of Kafka or the movies of David Cronenberg, for example, the ultimate stage of dehumanization most of the time is the loss of the ability to speak, actually, is the loss of, you don't have a voice anymore, and having a voice, being able to produce language is a key feature of any human, right? And I see the white supremacist response, the fact that we are not allowed to have actually a voice in politics, as a clear consequence of that dehumanization.
I understand in the report there was a section about the hijab, and it indicated that, or it stated that wearing the hijab is an indicator of Muslim Brotherhood affiliation. Like, how do they get away with making these sort of conflations between religious practice and links to political groups?
Because I think the purpose of the report really is what matters in here. Yeah. The actual content, doesn't really matter. There's actually a strong pattern in the war on terror of policies, pieces of legislation that are adopted and based on pseudo-scientific research, very biased expertise, that are not meant to be rigorous expertise, that are not meant to be objective, that are just meant to be essentially a pretext to legitimize further Islamophobic policies. In the British context, for example, the prevent policy became, as you know, a duty for every civil servant right after the extremism risk guidance. I think that's the name of the essentially piece of research that was promoted by the state and was directly questioned by, I think at the time was at least 140 academics, so many NGOs, of course, including Cage, that were directly questioning the scientific foundation, the scientific rationale of that guidance, to such an extent that most of these critics labeled that document as a science of pre-crime, essentially a fake science that was supposed to predict a potential form of so-called extremism. It unfortunately is still the foundation of a policy that is still being applied in Great Britain. So I think that that report in France serves a similar purpose. You need to have some kind of a foundation. even if it's nonsensical, that's not really the point. It exists, and as such, it serves the purpose.
My understanding is that Muslims count for around 10% of the population. I mean, it's quite
10%,
8 to 10% of the population. So we're a sizable number of Muslims, and the Muslim community is very large in France. What is the intended goal? You've mentioned it a few times, of the separatism, law of this report on Muslim Brotherhood. Like, what do they want to engineer within the Muslim community such that they would be satisfied that their work has been done?
I think there's no behavior that could actually satisfy the French system. Yeah, I really don't see that happening. Like, even if, because listen, if you look at the last 20 years, the hegemonic discourse amongst the Muslim community was actually an integrationist discourse. Oh, we're French like anyone else. We just want to enjoy the same rights. Let's avoid discrimination. But we don't really have any strong will to engage in, for example, an autonomous path. Muslim autonomy really isn't what we're trying to do in here. Integrationism, legalism, non-violence. These three pillars were actually the pillars of the overall Muslim discourse in France. And despite that, those who pioneered, those who championed that discourse were closed down by the state a few years ago. Really? So what are we supposed to do? Just maybe completely abandon Islam? Maybe, but I'm not sure that's a proper solution.
Okay. Now, of course, the global context of all of this is the war on Gaza.
Of course.
Or the genocide in Gaza, let's call it. And is there a context on the domestic level where Gaza plays into, or Gaza is a feature in this sort of attack on the Muslim community?
Clearly, of course. I think what we are currently seeing is quite similar to what happened in 2001. We're seeing a legitimate act of political violence carried by Muslims with whatever the moral appreciation we have on political violence. It has a context, it has some degree of explanation, right? And that act of political violence catalyzed an extremely strong Islamophobic response. Of course, in Palestine, it's called a genocide, but similarly to what happened in the first years of the war on terror, you have essentially a classic, I was about to say war, but it's not even a war, it's a genocidal war. It's actually a genocide that is happening where we believe that the culprits actually live in, but then the entire Muslim community is directly associated with those who carried out these acts of political violence. And hence, they are also seen as culprits, or at least people who were complicit, and hence people who deserve a degree of punishment. That translated into the prevent policy in the UK, so many laws, counter-terrorism powers in the US, in France, in the UK as well. And that's essentially what we are, I think, currently seeing right now. These, the shocking denial of French Islamophobia, the shocking response to these Islamophobic murders, the very existence of these Islamophobic murders are, I believe, a response catalyzed by the events in Palestine.
And so I understand that there are some pro-Gaza groups, Palestine groups, who have been involved in activism. And actually maybe say a little bit about the repression of pro-Palestinian activism. But I understand there are pro-Gaza groups that are now potentially going to be shut down by the state.
Exactly. On top of that, so the murders are taking place, the report is being published, and on top of that, the largest pro-Palestinian group in the country, Urgence Palestine, that is essentially the leader of the pro-Palestinian discourse, essentially the group that is organizing every pro-Palestinian march in the country since 2023, received a letter, a notification from the government a few weeks ago announcing that essentially the government wants to shut it down. Right. And we are currently expecting the legal process goes as such. The government sends a letter. It explains the reasons why, the motive behind the potential decision. The organization can respond. not appeal. It's not a judicial appeal yet. They essentially can respond via email or sending a letter explaining that they might not want to be shut down. And then the next step is literally the government sending a second letter, this time announcing the proper dissolution. And we're expecting this in the next few days.
Why? Why shut down this group at this moment?
I think that decision is, of course, is a direct consequence of the French complicity with the Zionist regime in France, and as such, there's a global trend that tries to silence any voice that is supportive of the Palestinian struggle right now. And the way that trend is, of course, global, but the way it manifests in France is quite brutal, because the French government has access to executive measures that are that allow it to actually completely shut down, completely close down organizations that are deemed illegitimate in the country. So that's the best. Unfortunately, that's the best strategy they can use, and that's the reason why they're using it.
I mean, have these pro-Palestine groups had an impact on Palestinian activism, on public opinion? You know, for example, in Britain now, I think it's fair to say that there is a majority of Brits who are against this genocide, and we can see that the attitudes of the media are changing. Even some elements of the political establishment is shifting because of that public opinion shift. You know, you've described a very Islamophobic population, if that's a right phrase to use. Does that imply that they are, in effect, the population is in effect not on the side of the Palestinian cause?
I think that Urgence Palestine was very successful in being able to share the proper narrative on what's currently happening in Palestine in the French context, which was in and of itself a success. I am not sure that a majority of the population is actually siding with the Palestinians, or at least believe that the genocide is quite shocking. I'm not sure. Maybe that might be the case, but I'm not seeing the same degree of success you guys witnessed in the British context. Maybe it's possible, but I believe that their main victory is that they were able to successfully organize quite large march protests in the country. And as a result, at least one party, France Unbowed, La France Insoumise, essentially adopted a discourse that very clearly condemns the genocide, describes what's happening in Palestine as a genocide, which is in and of itself a success, and I won't say sides with the Palestinian resistance, because that's not true, but supports the Palestinian population in its endeavor to survive. Let's say that this way. Let's put it this way.
Right. So there isn't really a domestic, apart from this far-left group, there isn't really a domestic pressure that has been put on Macron. But then Macron has, you know, of course, it's not enough, and it's very little, but Macron has, I think, led the European response to sanctioning, you know, these two MPs these two ministers, Israeli ministers, in calling for a two-state solution. There was some talk about holding a conference where a two-state solution would be declared by some European states. Macron has become stronger in his language against Netanyahu. And of course, the Americans have been taken aback by this. So how do we square this newfound approach, I suppose, towards Palestine of the Macron government and the lack of intensity, the lack of domestic pressure?
I think it's not really a consequence or the expression of a pro-Palestinian sentiment led by Macron or the French political spectrum. It's actually, I believe, an heritage of the past. If you look at the way the French positioned itself in the Arab context post the independences in the African world, in the Arabic world as well, it tried to depict itself as a neutral diplomatic force. And the reason why it adopted, or at least it tried to adopt that discourse, is because you need to to imagine that at the end of the 60s, in the 70s as well, France was regarded as the most brutal colonial empire, the one that butchered Algerians, the one that butchered so many colonial subjects. So its public image was quite bad, actually. So in order to reshape that and not being regarded in this new world order as the violent and racist state that it actually was, they essentially de Gaulle at the time adopted what he called the Arab policy, which essentially translates into a quite neutral language, especially on the Palestinian context, essentially saying that Israel has a right to exist, but the Palestinian state as well, and the borders of the Palestinian state should be respected, and we should condemn any invasion attempt by colonial settlers. That's not something that we should support. That at least was the discourse. And I think that's the reason why Macron is trying to keep some connection, because he believes that it gives him some credibility in the Arabic world, in the Muslim world. Maybe that it's also giving him some credibility amongst the Muslim community in France. At least that's his rationale. Hopefully not. But that's, I think, the reason why. Because if you look at actually the proper policies, the decision-making, the concrete actions of the state, very clearly France is a direct complicit of the Zionist regime. We've seen, so many NGOs have gathered sufficient evidence that demonstrates that French ammunitions were actually sent to the Zionist regime and used by the Zionist regime against Palestinians. So it's mainly PR, and I would argue that it's even it's badly written PR. It's not even successful, as you've mentioned.
Rayan, can you encapsulate the feeling, the sentiments of the Muslim community in France today? I know that it's not a monolith, and Muslims are very diverse in France, but at the same time, we've got a community here who for many years has been subject to state indifference and then state discrimination. We've got a community here who've been subject to horrific laws like the separatism law, this new report, the banning of the hijab, of course, goes back many years. The conflation between Islamic practice, spiritual Islamic practice, and the link to political Islam. I remember, again, it was the interior minister who went into a supermarket and said, this is separatism.
True,
he pointed to a halal meat aisle,
exactly.
I think. There's a halal meat aisle.
He said that's separatism.
That's separatism, right? So, you've got this deluge of anger coming from the state. And of course, we haven't talked about media, who I would imagine is as a complicit in this Islamophobic rhetoric.
Of course.
What sort of effect is that having on the ordinary Muslim who lives in France?
As you've mentioned, the community is quite diverse, but for certain, there's a degree of discouragement. There's a degree of political paralysis as well that is currently going on in the community, which is quite understandable, because they know that if they're trying to, if they're just try to be vocal on the injustices in Palestine, on the injustices in France, then the consequences could be quite harsh. Closing down of an organization, the raids that come along, the house arrests. Some house arrests took place. Hundreds of house arrests actually took place last year during the games, the Olympic Games that that happened in Paris. Yeah. Hundreds of Muslims were placed under house arrest for the entire summer in order to protect national cohesion and the security of the state. Of course, a pretext. So it's quite the price to pay is quite high. So of course, it's quite difficult to. For some in the community, it's quite difficult to envision a future in France, actually. So some of them, there's a book that was published a few months ago that proved that at least 10,000 Muslims fled the country, made hijrah, right, in order to find a better place where they could live as Muslims without being criminalized to that extent. Yeah. And of course, hijrah remains a a clear solution for some of us, but it's not necessarily something that everyone can do. You mentioned we are maybe 6, 7 million Muslims in France. Of course, no one, not the entire community cannot leave the country right now. Hopefully, what I'm also witnessing is the rise of a new generation of activists, researchers, grassroots organizers that I'm also a part of, but even people that are younger than me, people who actually were born in the water, who were born after 2001. And their mental landscape was completely shaped by the water, by the French Islamophobia, by the French policies against Muslims, and so on and so forth. Hopefully, that the emergence of that generation, hopefully, if it is trained properly, if it survives the state attempts at essentially erasing collective memory, our collective memory of struggle and the lessons we gathered in the last 20, actually 30 years, then hopefully we might be able to be maybe more successful in the future. At least that's my hope.
We're in Britain at the moment. We're sitting in London, and of course we have our challenges in the UK, but we also have a community here which is essentially socially mobile. You know, there are young Muslims who are entering the workplace and who are making their way through society with all the challenges that they face.
Entrism from the Muslim Brotherhood.
This is what they would call entrism. So, you know, in the French context, do we see that level of, you know, they would call it integration. We wouldn't go that far. We would say that this is, you know, just the normal engagement that we have. Do we have that level, or is Islamophobia so pervasive in French society that on a sort of very basic level, Muslims are denied that level of access to work in civil society?
There's that degree of engagement, of course, which, as you've mentioned, is a natural consequence of the community's presence in the country. But we're facing challenges that are quite I think, specific to the French context. In France, for example, there's an unwritten rule in the workplace, according to which women who wear hijab are essentially banned from actually finding a job. That doesn't mean they don't find a job, but what I'm trying to say is that it's extremely hard for them to actually find a place in the workplace. Right? It's extremely difficult. Even for, and we're seeing that trend as well for Muslim men, who are overtly practicing Islam, who have a beard, who do not necessarily shake hands with the other gender, and so on and so forth. It's becoming, the discriminatory practices in the workplace are quite common in France. So the engagement is there, of course, it's a natural consequence of our presence, but the challenges are very numerous. And that as well impacts the psychological landscape of the entire Muslim community. That doesn't mean I'm listening to myself, I'm like, wow, I'm depicting something that is very dark. It is dark, but hopefully as a result of our spiritual identity, I think we have a degree of resilience and resistance that is quite specific to us, right? As a direct result of our beliefs and our practice. So hopefully that doesn't mean that we are essentially stuck in a dead end and we won't be able to find solutions. Hopefully we will, but it's clear that the challenges are very numerous.
You know, these challenges are numerous. Things are not so good for Muslims in France. How would you answer the following question or following query? Le Pen came first in the last presidential election, at least when it comes to vote share. Presidential elections are coming up, and it's very likely and very possible, commentators are suggesting, that Le Pen could even take the presidency.
True.
Wouldn't that be a worse situation for Muslims in France? And so the question is, shouldn't Muslims in France do everything in their power now to prevent a Le Pen victory, even if that means, and you know, I'm sure you would suggest otherwise, but even if that means to support the coalition of groups who essentially will stand against Le Pen, many of whom have passed these separatism laws and continue this Islamophobic policies.
Yeah, of course. I think if we exclusively see things short term, of course, 2027, the likelihood of a Le Pen's victory is quite devastating.
Right.
But I think we need to force ourselves into having a more distant look and essentially trying to see things not just short term, but actually medium, if not long term, actually. And as I've mentioned, we are fully entering a new political chapter. And that political chapter is, of course, the era of genocidal Islamophobia. And in that chapter, we are witnessing the rise of a new generation of Muslims. And what truly matters for me is actually our ability to focus on ourselves and our ability to learn from the lessons of the last 25, 30 to 30 years, actually. To me, that's the main thing. If we're able to maintain our collective memory of struggle, if we're able to share what actually was successful, what was not successful, I think we can identify unexplored avenues for political growth. And more specifically, I think the main pillar that should remain, I think, our ideal, I don't like the term because most of the time ideals don't become reality, don't become true, but you get the point, is to clearly endeavor for Muslim autonomy. The idea is, at least in the French context, the more we tried to integrate, the more we were repressed, right? So it's clearly not functioning. I would even argue further that it's not directly in line with our beliefs and actually our Muslimness. But that's another discussion. But at least trying to focus on ourselves as much as possible and avoid what partially happened in the African-American community after these struggles of the 70s and the 70s, what Cornel West identifies as the black elite betrayal, who essentially enjoyed the successes of the social rights movement and then fully integrated in the white supremacist landscape and system. How do we go from a community that supports Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, W.E. Du Bois, to a community that is okay with sending their children to the police or the American army, that are actually institutional pillars of white supremacy? How did that happen, right? I think that's the potential threat that could happen in the Muslim community in France if we do not maintain our collective memory of struggle and do not remain true to, of course, our beliefs and our endeavor towards Muslim autonomy. I think that's the clear danger. It really is a clear danger because there's a possibility you might be born Muslim, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to die Muslim. That doesn't necessarily mean your children are going to die as Muslims. So I think that this is a clear danger and something that we can easily prevent if we're able to learn from the lessons of the past very clearly. For example, it's actually completely unacceptable that as a Muslim community, we in France, we haven't addressed the impact of counterterrorism powers and the way they were developed in France and their impact on Muslims in the last 30 years, because we don't want to be associated with political violence or whatever. That's not a mature political reaction. If you look at the British context, this is something that is widely acknowledged. You cannot conceptualize Islamophobia in the US or in Great Britain without taking into account, without analyzing the impact of these counterterrorism powers. The way French Islamophobia was conceptualized in the last essentially 35 years, it was conceptualized without taking into account the development and the impact of counterterrorism powers that predominantly targeted and impacted Muslims. That's not something that we can explain that, but of course it's a mistake of the past and it's something that we need to integrate in our future discourse, in our future political language, inshallah.
Rayan, I've asked you this question before and you've always said to me, the question is, have you ever thought about leaving France? Because of course the persecution, the challenges are enormous with the Muslim community in France? And your answer has always been, but I have work to do there. Now, we know that you're a member of CAGE, a civil liberties organization.
And the Muslim Brotherhood.
And how do we, explain to me the work you do within the Muslim community in France and what you're trying to achieve in the French context?
Yeah, essentially, apart from the research that I'm conducting on French Islamophobia and the manifestations of the war on terror in the French context, apart from the casework that I'm trying to support Muslims impacted by the French policies and more specifically the counterterrorism powers used by the state, what we're trying to do, I'm not alone, we're actually trying to train politically that new generation, the generation that I've mentioned earlier, trying to instill in their mind a degree of ghira, a degree of you actually have to be proud of your Muslimness, of your Islam, and so on and so forth. And we're seeing that at times we don't even need to do that because it's already there. Mm-hmm. One of the consequences of of deep persecution of state-led Islamophobia is actually that part of the community regards its Muslimness as their key aspect of their identity, something they cannot relinquish, right? Because it's directly targeted by the white supremacist system. So it's in a way it's a positive consequence of an unfair system. So that's essentially the kind of work that we're trying to do on the ground, and hopefully we'll be victorious, inshallah. I'll answer the way I answered last time. It's like, if we're not victorious in here, at least we're victorious in the akhirah, so we're not losing anything.
Rayan Freschi, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.